I'm going to go over the Chapter 15 homework problems. So this first homework problem is very straightforward. It's just entering the direct materials, direct labor, and overhead into the job cost sheet. They give you the direct materials and the direct labor. They tell you the overhead. So that's pretty simple. The next one. Okay, so in this one, we've got 3 jobs. One job was in process. So this is our beginning work in process, job number 120, and they tell you what was on the job cost sheet at that point. Then they tell you what was added, okay? It's very important to spend time reading because here they broke it down and they told you what was in beginning work in process, what was added during the month. If you see a job cost sheet, a completed job cost sheet like what we did here, okay, you don't necessarily know what was beginning work in process, what was added during the month. And so be careful on the quiz. I think the quiz makes you distinguish. They tell you what was on the job cost sheet at the end, and then you have to go back and read what they started the period with. So reading the paragraph, very important. I just want to point that out. Okay, so on problem 2, we've got 3 jobs. Okay, you're going to, in requirement 1, you're going to record the journal entries. So the journal entries are explained in the chapter. When you read the chapter, you'll see all the various journal entries. Another thing you can do, where I want to be now, is if we go to the week 3, obviously everybody, first stop of the week is the overview page. So you should have read this. And if you scroll down to the resources, under additional demonstration videos, here I go through the transactions and I put them in T accounts. So, I mean, if you have it in the T account, you can make the journal entry because you know what's debited and what's credited. So this may be helpful. Also, calculating the income statement amounts, this may also be helpful. Actually, all 3 of these videos will be helpful for you to do the homework problems. Okay, so you'll go through and you'll do all of the journal entries. And let's see, you are given the overhead rate. So you'll use that for C, applying the overhead. Requirement 2, okay, you'll have to go back to this information here. We've got the 3 jobs. Job 120 is sold, 121 is started and completed, 122 is started and still in process. So you'll need to put the cost for the job that is still in process, right? You'll choose the job, and then you'll choose the job that's in finished goods, completed but not yet sold, and put in that information. Okay. Next question, 3. Okay, so again, go back to, actually this one, I think that calculating the income statement amounts is probably going to be more helpful for this one. Go back and watch these videos to get a little bit of help. Okay, and you're just pulling out the amount. So this is understanding how the goods flow, right? From raw materials into work in process, right? Direct labor into work in process, apply the overhead into work in process, and then when it's completed, it flows into finished goods. Okay, when it's sold, comes out of finished goods, goes in cost of goods sold. Okay, so that's just kind of making you pull those amounts. That's what requirement 1 is, pulling those amounts out of the T accounts. Requirement 2 is computing the amount of overhead that is over-applied or under-applied. And so this video here, applying overhead, will help you out with that concept. All right, problem 4. Okay, here's requirement 1. This one, usually we know overhead, we calculate the predetermined overhead at the beginning of the period, so we're using estimated overhead, but this one is the overhead at later in the period, so you're going to use total overhead applied divided by the allocation base for this one. And then when you'll have that overhead rate for this last one, they tell you the ending work in process of 37,000. I'm sorry, 88, well, whatever your number is, because then you'll get different numbers. They tell you the ending work in process. They tell you how much is direct labor, right? And so we know our work in process, we have direct materials, direct labor, and overhead. they tell you the direct labor. Based on the overhead rate you get in requirement 1, you can then figure out the overhead, okay? And then whatever left in work in process inventory is going to be your direct materials. So you'll start with the total work in process, back out labor and overhead, and then that'll leave you with materials. In problem 5, okay, requirement 1, you're going to calculate the overhead, and then this is the one you will be using the estimated overhead that we're used to, and you'll get an overhead rate. Requirement 2, okay, and actually I filled these in, right? It's going to come like this, right? This is the T account, and here's the line for the T, right? Here's the T. And so we've got a column for the labels for the debit side of the T, and then the credit and the labels on the credit side of the T. So you'll drop in the amount for actual overhead, okay, and that's given to you. And then the applied overhead is what you will have gotten using our overhead rate. In requirement 1, you can figure out the overhead applied, and then the difference is either going to be over or under applied overhead, just depending on if the actual overhead was more or less than the applied. Okay. Requirement 3 is you're going to close the under or over applied overhead. Okay. And again, go back to that applied overhead video. I show you how to do that, as well as it's in the chapter. Then we're going to get to problem 6, and 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 is really all one problem. It's different parts of one problem. Okay, so each part isn't that big. So when you see 10 problems, really 5 of them are one problem. It's a 5-part problem. Okay, so the first one, you're going to get the overhead applied to each job in April. So here we've got 3 jobs again. 2 of them were in process at the beginning of April. Okay. And then 1 was started in April. Okay. And so you can see from the overhead applied and the direct labor, you can see what the overhead rate is. They give you the overhead rate is. So you're going to apply the overhead rate for April using that rate, right? And the direct labor. So you'll get the overhead applied in this part of the problem. Then the next part of the problem, you're going to be completing the job cost sheets, okay? So we can just add up the March costs, and that gives us our beginning work in process. We've got the materials and labor for April. You're going to apply the overhead to the 3 jobs, okay, using the rate, or actually just using the amounts. You'll just pull the amounts from 6 and drop them in to the job cost sheets. Now you can total up the sheets, and then they want you to choose which one is work in process inventory, which job is finished goods inventory, which job is cost of goods sold inventory. And that's based on the information here. Job 306 was finished and sold. 307 was finished but not sold. Job 308 is in process. So then we can get to 8, and now we're going to do all of the journal entries. Okay. And so these are pretty straightforward, again, similar to what we used in that previous exercise. And as I said, there's videos on the week overview page to watch that. Okay. Couple things I want to point out to you. F is overhead costs applied to work in process inventory. You'll just go and get that from what you put in here in 7, so you can just grab that number to do that journal entry. Okay. G is you're going to be recording the actual overhead costs, and they tell you the actual overhead, indirect materials and indirect labor. They would have already had you do that in D and E transactions. So you're going to be recording the rent, utilities, and depreciation. And they tell you rent and utilities are paid in cash, so we credit cash for that. But depreciation, we do not pay for depreciation. When we record depreciation, what account do we credit? So go back to that. H, We're going to transfer jobs 306 and 307. So go back to problem 7 to get those costs. We're going to record the cost of goods sold for job 306. Go to problem 7 to get the cost of job 306. And then K, we're going to close the underapplied or overhead or overapplied overhead. And so draw a T account, get a piece of paper, draw a T account for factory overhead, and then debit it for the actual overhead that you debited. So you can go back and look at this journal, view it as a general journal. I don't have any in here, but you'll be able to see all the transactions. So you'll see all of the debits to factory overhead, put those on the debit side of the T. And then you'll see a credit to factory overhead when you applied it in F, put that on the credit side of the T. And then you'll see the balance in overhead. You'll see whether it's over-applied or under-applied, and then you're going to close that to cost of goods sold. So that'll be your last entry in K. That'll bring you on to problem 9, the next part of the problem, and you're going to do a schedule of cost of goods manufactured. So we learned how to compute the cost of goods manufactured last week in chapter 14, and so you'll go ahead and you'll fill this out, okay? And so we can grab these amounts actually. We can grab these from problem 8. Right? We can grab the direct materials, the direct labor, the overhead, and it will be overhead applied, okay? And then your beginning and ending work in process, you will get that from problem 7, okay? So you can grab that from the job cost sheets. And then finally in 10, the last part of this problem, we're going to do our gross profit first, right? And so you recorded the sales. That was already given to you. The cost of goods sold, okay, if we go back to problem 8, the cost of goods sold, right, would have been recorded in I. But then don't forget cost of goods sold then was also adjusted in K. So you need to factor in both of those amounts to get the cost of goods sold, and then you can get to the gross profit. And then requirement B in this problem, the raw materials, they tell you the beginning balance of raw materials, they tell you what they've purchased, and then you can go back and look at your journal entries in problem 8 and see the direct materials that you used, okay? You can grab those from the journal entries, or you can even just go back to problem 7 and pull that off of the job cost sheets. Okay, so that's how you get to your raw materials balance. Your work in process balance, you'll go back and you'll list the cost of the job that's in work in process. You can grab that from problem 7 and then go back to problem 7 and put down the cost, get the cost of the job completed. Okay, so hopefully that helps with the problem, working on the problems.